Major conflicts almost never begin as wars. They begin as something smaller, more manageable, more justifiable, a targeted strike, a calibrated response, a necessary signal sent to an adversary who needs to understand consequences. The language surrounding these actions is almost always the same: limited, proportionate, controlled. Leaders on every side genuinely believe this framing at the moment decisions are made. They believe the action will land, deliver its message, and allow the situation to stabilize without further deterioration. History suggests this belief is far more fragile than it appears in the room where the decision is taken. The current tension between the United States, Israel, and Iran did not emerge from a single event or a single decision made by a single actor. It is the accumulated product of decades of actions, each framed as necessary corrections to a situation already deteriorating. Sanctions designed to constrain without provoking open conflict. Proxy engagements designed to impose cost without triggering direct confrontation. Strikes on nuclear infrastructure framed as defensive measures against an existential threat. Each action was presented as a way of managing the situation rather than escalating it. Each action produced a response that required further management. The architecture of the current moment was built decision by decision across years of choices that each seemed, at the time, to be the more controlled alternative. Escalation rarely announces itself as war. It begins quietly, with decisions framed as necessary, limited, and temporary. The problem is that the other side is also making decisions framed exactly the same way. When a military strike lands, the responding party faces a decision that is simultaneously strategic and deeply psychological. The strategic calculation involves weighing costs, capabilities, alliance commitments, and escalation risk. But beneath the strategic layer, something more fundamental is operating: the fear of appearing weak in a domain where weakness invites further aggression. This is not an irrational fear. In the context of international security, credibility functions as a form of deterrence. A nation that absorbs a strike without responding communicates to every adversary that strikes carry manageable consequences. The long-term cost of that signal can exceed the short-term cost of the original attack. This logic is well understood by every actor in the current conflict. Iran understands that absorbing Israeli or American strikes without response undermines its regional standing and the credibility of its deterrence posture. Israel understands that allowing Iranian proxy attacks to accumulate without consequence invites escalation from a position of apparent tolerance. The United States understands that its commitments to regional allies require visible willingness to impose cost when those allies are threatened. Each party is responding not only to what the other side did, they are responding to what the failure to respond would communicate. Reciprocity runs deep in human psychology and deeper still in strategic culture. Action demands response, not because response is always strategically optimal, but because the absence of response carries its own severe cost in the currency of perceived resolve. Once action is taken, the decision facing the other side is no longer purely strategic. It becomes psychological in ways that narrow the available options considerably. There is a well-documented pattern in human decision-making that applies with particular force to geopolitical conflict. The more resources committed to a course of action, the harder it becomes to reconsider that course, independent of whether the original rationale remains valid. Behavioral economists call this escalation of commitment. In financial markets, it produces investors who hold losing positions far past the point where the thesis warrants continuation. In geopolitical conflict, it produces something considerably more consequential. Leaders who have committed military assets, political capital, and public credibility to a position face enormous pressure to continue rather than reassess. Backing down carries a domestic political cost that can threaten the leadership itself. It carries a reputational cost in the international environment where resolve is continuously being evaluated by allies and adversaries simultaneously. It carries a military cost when forces have been positioned and mobilized in ways that create their own momentum toward engagement, and it carries a psychological cost that is perhaps the least discussed, but most significant of all. Admitting that a previous decision has produced an undesirable outcome requires a form of intellectual honesty that political environments actively punish. The sunk cost is not only financial or military. It is embedded in every public statement made, every alliance commitment activated, every domestic audience addressed with confidence about the necessity and correctness of the path chosen. The more a nation invests in a decision, the harder it becomes to reconsider it without the reconsideration itself becoming a strategic liability. This is not a failure of intelligence among decision makers. It is the predictable output of incentive structures that reward visible commitment and punish visible uncertainty. Every party to the current conflict operates with a shared assumption that is worth examining carefully. The assumption that escalation can be calibrated precisely enough to achieve its objectives without triggering a response that exceeds manageable boundaries. This belief is not irrational given the tools available to modern military and diplomatic establishments. Precision strike capabilities, back-channel communication, graduated response frameworks, all of these exist precisely to create the conditions for controlled escalation. But history provides a consistent record of how reliably this belief fails under real conditions. The First World War was not planned as a global conflict by any of its initiating parties. It was a series of decisions each made within a framework of controlled escalation that assumed the other side would respond within predictable parameters. The parameters proved incorrect. The Cuban Missile Crisis came closer to nuclear exchange than any of its participants publicly acknowledged for decades afterward. Not because leaders sought that outcome, but because the situation generated dynamics that moved faster and in more directions than any single actor could fully track. In the current environment, the complexity is compounded by the number of actors involved. Direct state actors, proxy forces operating with varying degrees of independence, alliance commitments that automatically implicate parties not directly targeted. A strike on Iranian-backed forces in one theatre creates pressure to respond in multiple theatres simultaneously. A response that miscalculates the threshold of a third party's tolerance can activate commitments that none of the original parties intended to trigger. Escalation often grows not because leaders desire a larger conflict. It grows because they believe they can prevent one while continuing to impose cost. That belief, sincerely held on every side, is precisely what makes the situation structurally dangerous. There is a threshold in the development of geopolitical conflict where escalation stops being primarily a decision and becomes primarily a process. Individual choices still occur, but they occur inside a momentum that has developed its own internal logic, its own timeline, its own pressure toward continuation. Retaliation cycles develop their own rhythm. Each response creates the conditions for the next response before the strategic value of the previous one has been fully assessed. The tempo of events begins to exceed the tempo of careful deliberation. Strategic misinterpretation becomes more likely as the pace increases. A defensive repositioning is read as preparation for offensive action. A communication delay is interpreted as final decision rather than process. A calibrated, limited strike lands in a context where the other side's threshold for response has already been significantly lowered by the accumulated weight of previous exchanges. Alliances that were designed as deterrents begin to function as transmission mechanisms. A commitment made to prevent a conflict from starting becomes a commitment that makes it harder to stop one once it has begun. De-escalation faces its own severe psychological barriers in this environment. The leader who proposes de-escalation before achieving the stated objective of the military action risks appearing to have absorbed cost without achieving purpose. The domestic political cost of an unresolved conflict can exceed the perceived cost of continuation. And so the process continues not because continuation is clearly optimal, but because stopping has become politically and psychologically more difficult than proceeding. Escalation is rarely the product of a single catastrophic decision made by a single reckless actor. It is the accumulated output of many decisions, each made under genuine uncertainty, each framed as necessary and controlled, each producing consequences that narrowed the options available to everyone who came after. Wars often begin with confidence in control. They continue because that control proves far more fragile than the confidence it was built upon. The pattern is not new. What changes with each iteration is the scale of what becomes possible before anyone finds a way to stop it.